The room went cold the moment the human delegate stood up. I remember thinking, in that first frozen second, that I had misjudged everything. My name is Kesh. I am an Anoran, a species that has sat at the great negotiating table of the assembly for over 6,000 cycles. I have watched hundreds of species join our circle of stars, kneel a little, bow a little, sign what they are given, and be grateful for the scraps of territory we allow them. I expected humanity to do the same. I was wrong, and I felt that wrongness settle into my chest like a stone before I understood why. Let me take you back further, to when this all began, because you need to understand what we thought we knew before you can understand how badly we misjudged it. Humanity arrived in our shared space a little over a decade before that day. They came quietly at first, small ships slipping past our outer sensor nets, sending polite signals asking for permission to pass. Permission we granted with the same mild amusement we granted every young species. We had seen 100 civilizations rise from mud and metal, stumble their way into the stars, and beg for a seat at our table. Humans did not beg. That should have told us something from the very start. I was assigned to the human file 3 years after first contact. My superiors considered it a minor posting, a quiet corner of the assembly's business, good for someone who wanted a calm career without much risk. Humans, my supervisor told me, were curious but harmless. They asked too many questions. They argued about things that did not need arguing, but they were, by every measure we used, weak. Their ships were slow compared to ours. Their weapons, from what our scouts could tell, were unremarkable. Their numbers, while large, were spread across a handful of worlds instead of hundreds. On paper, humanity looked like every other new species we had absorbed into our system of trade and law. Interesting, but small. Manageable. I spent those early years watching human diplomats from a careful distance. I attended minor talks about mining rights along a shared border, about the naming of a nebula 3 species were fighting over, about the correct protocol for greeting a coalition elder. In every one of these meetings, I noticed something odd about the humans. They listened more than they spoke. When our translators struggled with the strange rhythm of their language, they waited patiently instead of growing frustrated the way most young species did. When they disagreed with a decision, they did not raise their voices. They asked why. Again and again, calmly, without anger, they asked why a rule existed, why a boundary was drawn where it was, why they were being asked to accept terms other species had never been asked to accept. At the time, I found this charming. My colleagues found it tiresome. One senior delegate, a broad-shouldered Corvain official named Threll, used to joke that humans were like children who had just learned the word why and could not stop using it. He was not wrong about the word. He was wrong about everything else. The summit that changed everything was called the Threshold Accord. It was meant to be simple, a formality really. Humanity had expanded faster than any species we had recorded, settling 12 worlds in the time it took most species to settle 2. The assembly grew nervous about this growth, not because humans had ever threatened anyone, but because nervousness is what old power feels when it sees something new growing quickly beside it. So the assembly called for a summit, and the purpose of that summit, though no one said it aloud, was to slow humanity down. I was given a seat in the observation gallery, several tiers above the main floor, close enough to see faces, far enough to be forgotten by the cameras. The chamber itself was built for grandeur, a vast circular hall with a domed ceiling that mimicked the night sky of 100 different homeworlds at once, shifting slowly so that every species present could see a piece of their own heavens above them. It was meant to remind us all that we were equals under the same stars. It mostly reminded newer species how small they were compared to the size of the assembly's history. The human delegation arrived exactly on time, which itself drew a few quiet comments from the gallery. Most young species arrived early, eager and nervous, hoping to make a good impression before the assembly's senior members even sat down. Humans arrived at the precise minute their appointment began, no earlier, no later. Their lead delegate was a man named Daniel Marsh, tall, plainly dressed in a dark gray suit with no medals or symbols of rank, which struck several of the older delegates as almost disrespectful. Every other species wore the weight of their titles on their bodies somewhere, a crest, a color, a mark of status. Marsh wore nothing but the suit and a quiet, unreadable expression. Beside him sat a woman named Grace Holloway, humanity's senior trade negotiator, and behind them 2 younger aides who took notes by hand instead of using the translation devices provided by the assembly. I remember thinking that was strange. Every other species relied entirely on assembly technology to bridge the language gap. The humans brought their own tools, small and unremarkable, but clearly built by human hands for human use. It was a small thing. It should not have mattered. But I noted it anyway, the way I noted every small thing about this species that refused to behave the way we expected. The Assembly's senior delegate for the summit was an elder named Vantor Thess, a Corvain official with 3 centuries of diplomatic experience and a reputation for never losing a negotiation. Vantor opened the summit the way he opened every summit, with a long and careful speech about unity, about the shared responsibility of all spacefaring peoples to maintain peace, about the privilege of being welcomed into a community as old and wise as the Assembly. It was the same speech I had heard him give to a dozen other new species, word for word in places, and every time the new species had nodded along, grateful and a little overwhelmed. Daniel Marsh did not nod. He listened with his hands folded on the table in front of him, his face calm, and when Vantor finished speaking, Marsh simply said thank you, in a tone that gave nothing away. Then Vantor began to read the terms. I will not pretend I understood, in that moment, exactly how one-sided those terms were. I had seen similar terms given to other species before, and I had accepted them as the normal cost of admission into galactic society. Humanity would be permitted to keep its 12 settled worlds, but any future expansion would require assembly approval. Human trade routes through shared space would be taxed at a rate 3 times higher than established coalition members. Human ships would be required to submit to inspection at any assembly checkpoint, at any time, without prior notice. And perhaps most striking of all, any dispute between humanity and an established coalition species would be settled by an assembly tribunal, one in which humanity would have no seat and no vote. As Vantor read each term, I watched the human delegation. Grace Holloway's expression did not change. The 2 aides continued writing by hand, calm and unhurried. Daniel Marsh listened to every word without interrupting, without so much as a shift in his posture. When Vantor finished, the chamber fell into the kind of silence that usually meant the room was waiting for gratitude. Marsh asked a question instead. He asked why the tax rate for human trade was 3 times higher than for established members, when humanity's trade volume was smaller than half the species already in the coalition. Vantor answered with something about the cost of integrating a new species into shared infrastructure, a vague answer that had satisfied every other species before. Marsh asked a second question, quieter this time, about why human ships alone would be subject to inspection without notice, when no other coalition member operated under that condition. Vantor's answer grew slightly less smooth. He spoke of trust needing to be earned, of humanity being new, and therefore requiring closer oversight for the safety of all. Marsh nodded slowly, as though considering this, and then he asked his third question, and this was the one that changed the temperature of the room. He asked how many species currently seated in the coalition had been required to accept these same terms when they first joined. Vantor did not answer right away. I do not think he had an answer, not one he was willing to say aloud, because the truth was that no species currently in the coalition had ever been asked to accept terms this unbalanced. Every species before humanity had joined smaller, weaker, and more desperate for protection than humanity had ever appeared to be. The terms had been built, quietly and deliberately, to slow down a species that was growing faster than anyone in that chamber was comfortable with. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. I remember feeling it in the gallery, a kind of collective held breath among the observers, waiting to see how Vantor would recover, and waiting, more than that, to see how the humans would react to being cornered in front of the entire assembly. Marsh did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward or point a finger or do any of the things I had seen younger species do when they felt insulted. He simply looked at Vantor, and then at the rest of the chamber, and said that humanity appreciated the invitation to join the coalition, and appreciated the effort that had gone into drafting the terms, but that humanity would not be signing the threshold accord as written. A murmur went through the gallery. I had never, in all my years watching these summits, heard a young species decline an offer from the assembly. Species negotiated for better terms. Species complained, delayed, asked for revisions. They did not simply say no and mean it. Vantor recovered quickly, the way experienced diplomats do, and offered to open the floor for renegotiation, suggesting that perhaps certain terms could be softened if humanity would explain its specific concerns in more detail. This was the moment, I believe now, when the assembly still thought it held all the power in the room, still thought humanity's refusal was simply the opening move of a negotiation rather than a final answer. Marsh thanked him for the offer and said that humanity would not be renegotiating today. He said that his delegation would return to their ships and that any future discussion would need to begin from a foundation of equal standing rather than the terms currently on the table. Then he stood, and Grace Holloway stood beside him, and the two aides closed their notebooks and rose as well, and the four of them walked out of the chamber together, unhurried, without a single glance back toward the gallery or the assembled delegates. The doors closed behind them with a soft mechanical sound that seemed far too quiet for what had just happened. For a long moment, no one in the chamber spoke. I looked down from the gallery at Vantor Thess, a delegate who had never once, in 3 centuries, been walked out on during a summit, and I watched him sit very still, his hands flat on the table in front of him, staring at the empty seats where the human delegation had been sitting only moments before. Around me, in the gallery, the reactions came in waves. Some delegates laughed, a nervous, disbelieving sound, already composing the story they would tell their governments about the strange, prideful young species that had walked away from the greatest alliance in the galaxy. Others simply looked confused, unsure whether what they had witnessed was foolishness or something else entirely. I said nothing. I sat very still, the same way Vantor sat still below me, and I felt that stone settle into my chest, the first small weight of a feeling I did not yet have a name for. I did not know, in that moment, that I was watching the last time humanity would ever ask the assembly for anything. I did not know that the silence that followed would last far longer than anyone expected, or that the silence itself would become the loudest thing any of us had ever heard. I only knew, as I watched those doors close, that something had shifted in the room, in the chamber, in the careful order of things the assembly had built over 6,000 cycles. I did not understand it yet, but I felt it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm arrives, long before the first drop of rain touches the ground. I gathered my things slowly, in no hurry to leave the gallery, watching the chamber below empty out in confused clusters of delegates who did not yet know what to make of what they had seen. Vantor remained seated long after everyone else had gone, staring at nothing, and I remember thinking, with a kind of quiet unease I could not explain, that I would give a great deal to know what he was thinking in that moment. I would learn, much later, that he had been thinking the same thing I was, wondering, for the first time in 3 centuries of easy victories, whether the assembly had just made a mistake it did not yet understand. The mockery began within a single day. I remember sitting in the assembly cafeteria, a wide-open hall built to accommodate the eating habits of 40 different species at once, listening to delegates from a dozen worlds trade jokes about the humans who had walked out of the Threshold Summit. Threll, the broad-shouldered Corvain official who had once compared humans to children, found the whole affair especially amusing. He predicted, loudly and with great confidence, that human ships would return within a month, tails lowered, ready to sign whatever terms they were given. He took bets from anyone willing to wager on it. Most of the gallery, myself included, said nothing, but I noticed that very few delegates actually took him up on the bet. Something about the calm way Marsh had walked out of that chamber made even the most confident among us hesitate to put credits on his return. A month passed. Then, too, human ships did not return. At first, this absence was easy to explain away. The Assembly's official statements described the walkout as an emotional reaction from an inexperienced species, unused to the formal weight of galactic diplomacy. Spokespeople suggested that humanity needed time to cool down, to consult among themselves, to realize the value of what they had been offered. Privately, among delegates who trusted each other enough to speak honestly, the explanations grew less generous. Humans were proud. Humans were foolish. Humans did not understand what they were giving up by refusing a seat at the greatest table in the galaxy. I found myself unconvinced by all of it, though I could not yet say why. I began, quietly and without telling my superiors, to track what little information came through about human activity beyond their own borders. It was not much. Human trade ships, which had once passed through 3 major shared corridors on a regular schedule, simply stopped appearing. At first, the traffic authorities assumed a temporary disruption, perhaps a technical issue or a change in shipping routes. But weeks became months, and the human vessels did not return to those corridors at all. Instead, quiet reports came in from freight coordinators noting that human cargo, once carried openly through shared space, was now being rerouted entirely around Assembly territory, adding weeks to journeys that had once taken days. This struck me as strange and increasingly costly. Humanity was choosing to spend enormous amounts of time and fuel simply to avoid us, rather than accept even the smallest continued contact with the coalition. I raised this observation once, carefully, during a low-level briefing with my supervisor, a broad and unhurried Anoran elder named Doss. He waved the concern away with the same confidence Threll had shown in the cafeteria. Humans were proud, he said. Pride was expensive. They would tire of paying that price eventually. I did not share his confidence, though I kept that doubt to myself for a long while. 3 months after the summit, the first strange report reached the Assembly's monitoring division, the department responsible for tracking activity along the edges of known space. A routine survey drone, passing near one of humanity's outer settlements on the edge of what they called the Meridian Belt, found the colony's communication signals had gone completely silent. Not damaged, not destroyed, simply silent, as though the entire world had chosen to stop broadcasting at once. The Assembly's monitoring division noted this with mild curiosity and filed it as an internal matter for humanity to resolve. No distress signal had been sent. No request for aid had come through. By every measure the Assembly used to judge such things, this was not an emergency. It was simply humans choosing, for reasons of their own, to go quiet. I found myself unable to let this observation go. I requested access to the monitoring division's full records on human activity, a request unusual enough that it required approval from 2 levels above my own rank. When the approval finally came, weeks later, I spent several long nights in a small viewing room reviewing satellite data, trade logs and border reports, trying to build a picture of what humanity had actually been doing in the silence everyone else was content to dismiss. What I found unsettled me more than I expected. Human colonies, one by one, were reducing their outward communication, not stopping entirely, which might have triggered concern from neighboring species, but scaling back to the bare minimum required to avoid raising alarms. Trade that once flowed openly between human worlds and neighboring coalition territories had been redirected inward, strengthening connections between human settlements instead of maintaining ties with the wider galaxy. Shipbuilding activity, visible through the faint energy signatures our satellites could detect from a distance, had increased at several human worlds, though the nature of what was being built remained frustratingly unclear. None of this, taken individually, meant much. Species reorganized their internal affairs constantly, for reasons that had nothing to do with the wider galaxy. But taken together, the pattern felt deliberate in a way that troubled me. Humanity was not simply sulking after a disappointing summit. Humanity was withdrawing, carefully and methodically, the way a person steps back from a doorway before deciding whether to walk through it, or slams it shut and locks it from the other side. I brought my findings to Doss again, more carefully organized this time, hoping the evidence would speak for itself where my earlier concerns had not. He listened politely, examined the reports I had gathered, and then offered an explanation that I found, at the time, almost convincing enough to quiet my unease. Humanity, he suggested, was likely consolidating its resources after the disappointment of the summit, focusing inward the way any young and prideful species might, licking its wounds before eventually returning to the table with a more reasonable attitude. He praised my diligence, told me my instincts as a diplomat were sound, and gently suggested that I not let a single unusual pattern become an obsession. There were, after all, 40 other species requiring the Assembly's attention, and humanity, having removed itself from active negotiations, was no longer strictly my concern. I accepted his reasoning, on the surface, but I did not stop watching. 6 months after the summit, a second report crossed my desk, this one impossible to dismiss as easily as the first. A Visari trading vessel, passing near the outer edge of human space, on a route that technically did not require permission to travel, reported a strange encounter. The Visari captain, a cautious and experienced trader named Aurel, described being approached by a single unmarked human vessel that matched speed with his ship at a distance, without any hostile posture, without weapons raised, without so much as an aggressive maneuver. A voice, calm and polite, informed Aurel over an open channel that his current route passed near territory humanity now considered sensitive, and requested, politely but firmly, that he adjust his course by a specific number of degrees. When Aurel asked what would happen if he declined, the voice on the other end simply repeated the request, in the same calm tone, without threat, without elaboration. Aurel adjusted his course. He later told Assembly investigators that something about the calmness of the request unsettled him more than any threat could have. He had encountered hostile ships before, species that postured and shouted and fired warning shots to assert dominance over contested space. He had never encountered a ship that made a request exactly once, calmly, and simply waited to see if it would be obeyed, as though the alternative to obedience was not worth explaining aloud. I read Aurel's report 3 times before I fully understood why it disturbed me so deeply. Every other species I had ever studied asserted power through display. Threats, warnings, shows of force meant to intimidate before conflict became necessary. Humanity, it seemed, had stopped displaying anything at all. They simply stated what they wanted, once, and trusted that the listener would understand the wisdom of listening. I began around this time to notice a shift in the wider mood of the Assembly, subtle at first, then harder to ignore. The confident jokes about human pride grew less frequent in the cafeteria. Threll stopped offering his bet about human ships returning within the month, though he never publicly admitted why. Delegates who had once dismissed humanity as an amusing curiosity began asking quieter questions in private briefings, questions that carried an edge of genuine uncertainty rather than idle interest. What were the humans building? Why had they gone so thoroughly silent? What, exactly, had made a Visari trading captain, a man known throughout his fleet for his steady nerves, describe a polite request from an unarmed human ship as the most unsettling encounter of his career? I requested, and was eventually granted, a temporary reassignment to the Assembly's newly formed Human Observation Committee, a small group tasked with monitoring the pattern of human withdrawal and reporting any significant developments directly to the senior council. It was not a prestigious posting. Most of my colleagues considered it a strange use of resources, monitoring a species that had, by every official account, simply chosen to remove itself from galactic affairs. But I could not shake the feeling that we were watching something far more significant than a prideful retreat, and I wanted to be close enough to see it clearly when the truth finally revealed itself. I did not have to wait much longer. 9 months after the summit, a full year's worth of silence and careful withdrawal came to an abrupt and startling end, and the galaxy, all at once, stopped laughing. The incident that broke the silence began, as these things often do, with a mistake made by a species that should have known better. The Drathan Cluster, a loose collection of worlds governed by a species known for their aggressive expansion and their long history of testing boundaries before anyone forced them to stop, had never fully accepted the informal border humanity established after the Threshold Summit. The Drathan were not part of the Assembly's inner council, though they maintained trade relationships with several member species, and their fleet commanders had a reputation for pushing into contested space whenever they believed no one was paying close enough attention to stop them. I learned the details of what happened only after the fact, pieced together from monitoring reports, intercepted communications, and the account of a young Drathan officer who later spoke to Assembly investigators in exchange for protection from his own government. A Drathan scouting fleet, 3 vessels strong, entered the outer edge of what humanity now quietly considered its territory, a region humanity had never formally claimed through any Assembly treaty, but had made clear, through the same calm and repeated requests other species had received, that it wished to keep clear of outside traffic. The Drathan commander, a veteran named Osav, known for his impatience with what he considered the timid caution of other species, ignored the request when it came. He believed, as many still did at that point, that humanity's calm manner was a sign of weakness rather than restraint. He pushed his fleet deeper into the contested region, toward a cluster of resource-rich asteroids that Drathan surveyors had identified as valuable, confident that humanity would either back down or prove too disorganized to respond in any meaningful way. Humanity responded within 4 hours. I want to be precise about what happened next, because in the months that followed, the story grew in the telling, exaggerated by fear and rumor until it became something almost mythical in the retelling. The truth, as best as I have been able to piece it together from official reports and the testimony of the young officer who later spoke to investigators, was both simpler and, in its own way, far more unsettling than the exaggerated versions that spread through the Assembly afterward. A single human vessel appeared at the edge of the Drathan scouting fleet's sensor range, close enough to be detected, far enough to avoid triggering an immediate defensive response. It made no aggressive maneuvers. It did not power weapons in any way visible to Drathan sensors. It simply matched the fleet's course at a careful distance and opened a communication channel, the same calm, polite voice that Orel the Visari trader had described nearly a year earlier, informing Commander Osav that his fleet had entered territory humanity considered closed to outside traffic and requesting that he withdraw. Osav, according to the young officer's later testimony, laughed at the request and ordered his fleet to continue toward the asteroid cluster, dismissing the single human vessel as either a bluff or a scout too outmatched to pose any real threat to 3 armed ships. The human vessel did not fire a single weapon. What it did instead was, in its own way, far more frightening. Within minutes, all 3 Drathan vessels lost navigation control. Their engines continued to function, their life support remained untouched, their weapons systems stayed fully operational, but the ships themselves became, in the young officer's words, unresponsive to any command related to movement. The fleet drifted, helpless, unable to advance toward the asteroid cluster or retreat back toward Drathan space, held in place by something none of their engineers could identify, trace, or override, no matter how many systems they attempted to reset or reroute. The human vessel did not approach further. It simply held its position at a distance, and the calm voice returned once more over the open channel, informing Commander Osav that navigation control would be restored once his fleet agreed to withdraw from the contested region, and that no further action would be taken against his ships or his crew. Osav, humiliated and furious, according to the young officer, spent nearly 6 hours attempting to restore control through every method his engineers could devise, refusing to accept the terms of a species he considered beneath the dignity of a formal negotiation. When his efforts continued to fail and his crew grew increasingly anxious at their helplessness, he finally agreed, through gritted teeth, to withdraw. Navigation control returned instantly. The human vessel did not follow the retreating Drathan fleet. It simply held position for several minutes longer, as though confirming the withdrawal was genuine, and then it turned and departed in the opposite direction, vanishing from Drathan sensors as quietly as it had appeared. No weapons had been fired, no lives had been lost, no damage had been done to a single Drathan ship beyond the wounded pride of a commander who had underestimated an opponent he did not understand. And yet, When the story reached the assembly through official Drathan channels a few days later, it spread through every level of galactic diplomacy, faster than any battle report I had ever seen circulate before. I remember the day the report reached the Human Observation Committee with unusual clarity, because it was the day I first saw genuine fear on the faces of colleagues who had spent the past year mocking humanity's quiet withdrawal from galactic affairs. Threll, the Corvain official who had once compared humans to children unable to stop asking why, read the report twice through in complete silence, and then set it down on the table without a word, staring at nothing in particular for a long moment before finally speaking. He asked, quietly, how a single unarmed vessel had disabled navigation control on 3 fully crewed warships without firing a shot, without deploying any visible boarding party, without any trace of the technology involved showing up on Drathan sensors before, during, or after the encounter. No one in the room had an answer. I spent the following weeks buried in every scrap of information the observation committee could gather, trying to understand what capability humanity had demonstrated, and I found, to my growing unease, that the more I learned, the less certain anyone seemed to be. Some analysts theorized a form of long-range electronic interference, though nothing in known physics explained how such interference could selectively disable navigation while leaving every other system untouched. Others suggested some form of direct neural interface with the Drathan ship's control systems, a technology no species in the assembly had ever successfully developed despite centuries of research. A few, quietly and without much confidence, suggested that humanity might have developed something entirely outside our understanding altogether, a possibility that unsettled even the most experienced scientists on the committee. What troubled me most, in the weeks that followed, was not the technology itself, but the restraint humanity had shown in using it. A 3-ship fleet, fully armed, had entered territory humanity wished to protect, ignored a direct and polite request to withdraw, and had been met not with destruction, not with casualties, not even with damage to their vessels, but with a calm, controlled demonstration of capability precise enough to make continued aggression pointless, and merciful enough to leave every option for peaceful resolution intact. It was, I came to realize slowly, and with growing discomfort, the most frightening kind of power a species could demonstrate. Not power used in anger, not power used to punish, but power used with such complete control that anger and punishment were never even necessary. I raised this observation during a full committee briefing, careful to keep my voice steady despite how unsettled I felt saying it aloud. I suggested that humanity's response to the Drathan incursion was not an isolated act of impressive engineering, but a message, deliberate and carefully calibrated, meant to be understood by every species watching from a distance. We do not wish to fight you. We are entirely capable of stopping you without fighting at all. The choice of what happens next belongs to you. Doss, my supervisor, who had spent the past year gently dismissing my concerns about human withdrawal, said nothing in response to my observation, which unsettled me more than any argument could have. He simply nodded, slowly, and made a note in the file in front of him, and I understood, in that silence, that even he had finally begun to feel the same unease that had been building in me for months. The reaction across the wider assembly, once the details of the Drathan incident became widely known, shifted quickly from disbelief to something closer to genuine alarm. Species that had once dismissed humanity as a curiosity began quietly reviewing their own border agreements with human territory, ensuring every request humanity had made over the past year had been fully honored, every rerouted trade corridor properly respected. Diplomatic channels that had gone cold since the Threshold Summit suddenly saw a flurry of cautious, carefully worded messages sent toward human space, none of them addressing the Drathan incident directly, all of them attempting, in their own indirect way, to re-establish some form of contact with a species the Assembly had spent the past year mocking and dismissing. Humanity did not respond to any of these messages. I found this silence, more than anything else, the most telling detail of the entire episode. A species that had just demonstrated the ability to disable a warship without firing a shot, a species that could have used the moment to demand concessions, to punish the Drathan publicly, to force the assembly back to the negotiating table on humanity's own terms, chose instead to say nothing at all. They had made their point once, calmly and without cruelty, and they seemed entirely content to let that single demonstration speak for itself, without repetition, without escalation, without any further attempt to explain or justify what they had done. I began to understand, in the weeks that followed, that this was perhaps the most unsettling truth about humanity that the galaxy had yet to fully grasp. They did not need to threaten twice. They did not need to remind anyone of what they were capable of. They said what they meant, once, and they trusted the rest of us to be intelligent enough to understand the weight of what we had witnessed. I requested a formal transfer to the Human Affairs Division shortly after the Drathan incident, no longer content to watch from the edges of a committee that seemed unsure whether it was studying a potential ally or a growing threat. My request was granted quickly, faster than any request I had made in my career, and I found myself, for the first time since the Threshold Summit had ended in silence, assigned to a task with real weight behind it. The Assembly's Senior Council, shaken by the Drathan incident and increasingly aware of how badly the initial summit had been handled, wanted a full and honest assessment of what humanity had become in the year since they walked away from our table. I was chosen, along with 2 senior analysts, to compile that assessment. It was, without question, the most important work of my career, and as I began gathering every scrap of intelligence the Assembly had collected on humanity's quiet, careful transformation, I could not shake the growing certainty that we were not simply studying a species that had grown stronger. We were studying a species that had, in the space of a single quiet year, become something the rest of the galaxy no longer fully understood, an understanding I had come to believe by then was the only thing standing between the Assembly and a mistake far more costly than a single humiliated commander drifting helplessly among the stars. The assessment took 4 months to complete, and by the time it was finished, I had come to know humanity better than almost anyone else in the Assembly who had never actually set foot on one of their worlds. I worked alongside 2 senior analysts, a methodical Visari researcher named Talus and a sharp-minded Corvain statistician named Orenda, both of whom brought a discipline to the work that I found myself grateful for as the picture we were building grew steadily more unsettling with every new piece of evidence we gathered. We drew from satellite data, trade records, intercepted communications, testimony from species that had encountered human vessels along the edges of their territory, and the few fragments of information humanity's own public broadcasts still offered to anyone willing to listen closely. What emerged from 4 months of careful work was not the story of a species retreating in wounded pride, as the Assembly had told itself for the better part of a year. It was the story of a species using an insult as fuel. Humanity, we discovered, had spent the year since the Threshold Summit not in isolation, but in transformation. Their population, spread across 12 settled worlds at the time of the summit, had grown to encompass 15 worlds by the time our assessment concluded, a rate of expansion that outpaced anything the Assembly had recorded from any species in recorded history. More striking than the number of worlds was the speed and efficiency with which each new settlement became fully self-sufficient, producing its own food, its own energy, its own manufactured goods within months, rather than the years or decades such development typically required for other species. Talus, reviewing the economic data with the kind of careful skepticism that made her one of the most respected analysts in the division, noted something that unsettled her more than the growth numbers themselves. Humanity's internal trade network, the careful web of resource sharing between their 15 worlds, showed almost no waste, no redundancy, no inefficiency of the kind every other species tolerated as an unavoidable cost of large-scale coordination. It was, she said during one of our late-night reviews, as though every human world had been given a single instruction the moment the summit collapsed, and every world had understood that instruction perfectly, without ever needing it repeated. Orenda's contribution to the assessment focused on humanity's military development, though even that phrase felt inadequate to describe what she uncovered. Humanity had not built a larger fleet in the traditional sense. Ship numbers, as best as our satellites could estimate, had grown only modestly since the summit. What had grown, dramatically and in ways our own engineers struggled to fully explain, was the sophistication of individual vessels. The Drathan incident, we now understood, had not been an isolated demonstration of some experimental technology. It appeared to be a standard capability across a meaningful portion of humanity's fleet, a level of control and precision that no coalition species had come close to matching despite centuries of technological development. I contributed what I could to the assessment from the diplomatic side, piecing together every fragment of communication humanity had sent or received since the summit, searching for some pattern in their intentions that might explain the direction all of this was heading. What I found, more than any specific policy or strategy, was a consistency of tone that ran through every single interaction, no matter how large or small. Humanity was never cruel. In the months following the Drathan incident, 3 further encounters occurred along the edges of human territory, each involving a different species testing the same boundary the Drathan had tested, each ending in the same calm, controlled manner. No lives lost, no unnecessary damage. A polite request, followed, if ignored, by a demonstration of restraint so complete it left no room for continued aggression, and then silence, without gloating, without demands for further concession, without any attempt to humiliate the species involved beyond the natural consequence of having been so easily and so gently stopped. I remember sitting with Talus and Orenda late one evening, reviewing the 4th such incident, this one involving a small coalition patrol that had wandered too close to human space without any hostile intent at all, simply a navigational error that had been corrected within minutes once the same calm voice made contact and explained the mistake. Talus pointed out, quietly, that this incident in particular told us something the others had not. Humanity was not simply defending territory. They were paying close enough attention to every ship near their borders to distinguish between genuine threats and honest mistakes, and they were choosing, every single time, to respond with exactly the amount of force required and not a fraction more. Orenda, who had spent decades studying the military histories of a dozen species before joining the Human Affairs Division, said something that night I have never forgotten. She said that every species she had ever studied, including her own, measured strength by what a species was willing to do. Humanity, she said, seemed to measure strength by what they were capable of doing, and chose, deliberately, not to do. That distinction, she believed, was the reason humanity had become the single most discussed subject across every corner of the assembly, more so than any war, any treaty, any crisis in living memory. Other species understood violence. Other species understood pride, and anger, and the desire to punish those who wronged them. What the assembly did not understand, and what frightened it more than any weapon could, was a species that held enormous and clearly growing power with what appeared to be complete emotional control, using that power only exactly as much as necessary, and never once for anything beyond simple, quiet protection of what belonged to them. Our final assessment, submitted to the Assembly's Senior Council 4 months after the Drathan incident, did not recommend military action of any kind. Talus, Orenda, and I agreed on this point without any real debate, because every scrap of evidence we had gathered pointed toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. Any attempt to test humanity's restraint through force would likely end the way the Drathan's attempt had ended, humiliating and costly in ways that had nothing to do with lives lost and everything to do with the slow, creeping realization across the galaxy that humanity could not be intimidated, could not be provoked into an overreaction, and could not be out-negotiated by anyone unwilling to offer them the same respect they had asked for from the very beginning. What we recommended instead, carefully and with full awareness of how difficult it would be for the Senior Council to accept, was a complete reversal of the Assembly's original approach. Humanity had asked, from the very first day of the Threshold Summit, for nothing more than equal standing, not preferential treatment, not special privileges beyond what any other species enjoyed, simply the same respect, the same fairness, the same voice at the table that every other member of the coalition had been granted upon joining. The senior council did not respond to our assessment immediately. I spent the following weeks in a strange kind of limbo, waiting to learn whether 4 months of careful work would result in any real change, or whether pride, the same pride that had shaped the original Threshold Accord, would win out over the plain evidence we had placed in front of the Assembly's most powerful voices. During that waiting period, a fifth incident occurred, one that I believe finally tipped the balance in favor of the recommendation we had made. A large coalition trade convoy, escorted by a modest military presence for protection against pirates along a dangerous stretch of shared space, found its planned route blocked by a region humanity had recently marked as sensitive following the discovery of a valuable mineral deposit. Rather than reroute, as every other trade convoy had learned to do by this point, the convoy's commanding officer, a proud and stubborn Corvain veteran, decided to test whether humanity's restraint had limits, pushing his escort ships forward in a deliberate show of coalition strength, meant to remind humanity that the Assembly was still the dominant power in the region. The response, this time, was different in a way that finally made the senior council understand what 4 months of careful analysis had already told me. A full formation of human vessels appeared, more ships than had been seen in any single location since the Threshold Summit, arranged with a precision that left no ambiguity about their capability. No weapons were fired, no ship was disabled. The formation simply held position, silent and complete, until the Corvain commander, faced with an overwhelming demonstration of readiness he had not expected, ordered his convoy to withdraw and reroute around the contested region. What struck everyone who reviewed the footage afterward, myself included, was not the size of the formation, impressive as it was, but the complete absence of any communication at all. No calm voice this time, no polite request, no explanation. Humanity had learned, it seemed, that after 5 separate incidents, words were no longer necessary. The ships themselves were the message, and the message was received with a clarity that no speech could have matched. I sat in the senior council's chamber 3 days later, invited to present the final version of our assessment in person, and I watched the faces of delegates who had once mocked humanity's walkout from the Threshold Summit, listen to every word with the kind of careful, humbled attention I had never seen the Assembly offer any species before, young or old. Vantor Thess, the same Corvain elder who had read humanity the original terms of the Threshold Accord over a year earlier, sat near the front of the chamber, and when I finished my presentation, he was the first to speak. He asked, quietly, whether I believed humanity would be willing to return to the negotiating table, given everything they had built and demonstrated in the time since they left. I told him the truth, as plainly as I could. I believed humanity had never actually wanted to leave the table permanently. I believed they had walked away because the terms offered to them treated their absence as a minor inconvenience rather than a real consequence, and I believed that the version of humanity, now waiting quietly beyond their borders, was not interested in punishing the Assembly for that mistake, but simply waiting to see whether the Assembly had learned anything from it. The chamber was silent for a long moment after I finished speaking. Then Vantor nodded, slowly, and turned to the rest of the council, and said the words I had been waiting a very long time to hear spoken aloud in that room. It was time, he said, to send a new delegation to humanity, not to dictate terms, to ask. I was chosen to join the new delegation, a decision that surprised me less than it might have a year earlier. I had spent so long studying humanity from a distance, tracing the shape of their silence through satellite data and second-hand reports, that it felt strange, almost unreal, to finally be given a seat on the ship that would carry the Assembly's second attempt at diplomacy directly into human space. Vantor Thess led the delegation himself, a decision that carried its own quiet weight. He could have sent a junior official, could have protected his own reputation by keeping distance from a mission that might fail as badly as the first one had. Instead, he chose to go in person, and I found a strange kind of respect growing in me for a man I had once considered little more than a symbol of everything slow and self-satisfied about the Assembly's old approach to diplomacy. Talus and Orenda joined the delegation as well, along with a small team of aides and translators. and Grace Holloway, humanity's senior trade negotiator, sent word ahead confirming the location for our meeting, a modest space station orbiting one of humanity's oldest settled worlds, a place they called simply the Waypoint. The name struck me as fitting, though I did not fully understand why until we arrived. The Waypoint was nothing like the grand ceremonial halls the Assembly used for its own summits. It was practical, efficient, built for function rather than display, with wide observation windows looking out over a green and blue world that reminded me, in some small way, of the pictures I had seen of humanity's original homeworld. There were no domed ceilings mimicking 100 different skies. There was no elaborate seating arranged by rank and status. Just a long table in a simply furnished room, chairs enough for both delegations, and windows that let in real light from the world below. Daniel Marsh was waiting for us when we arrived, along with Grace Holloway and two aides I did not recognize, though I noticed they were the same two who had taken notes by hand during the original Threshold Summit, still carrying the same small, quiet notebooks. Marsh looked, if anything, exactly as calm as he had a year and a half earlier, as though the events of the past 18 months had passed over him without leaving any visible mark at all. Vantor approached the table first, and I watched closely, curious to see whether the proud elder who had once read humanity a list of unbalanced terms without any real expectation of resistance would offer the same kind of formal, practiced greeting he had used at every summit I had ever observed him lead. He did not. He simply extended a hand, in the human gesture of greeting that I had seen described in reports but never witnessed in person, and said that the Assembly owed humanity an apology, plainly and without embellishment, before any formal proceedings had even begun. Marsh took the offered hand, and for the first time since I had begun studying this species, I saw something shift in his expression, a small, genuine warmth that had been entirely absent during the tense silence of the Threshold Summit. He said that he appreciated the apology, and that humanity had never wanted an apology, as much as it wanted a fair conversation, and that he hoped this time both delegations could build something worth keeping. We sat, and the negotiations that followed bore almost no resemblance to the summit I had witnessed a year and a half earlier. Vantor did not read a prepared list of terms. Instead, he asked Marsh directly what humanity believed fair terms would look like, and then, remarkably, he listened, the same careful, patient listening I had once seen Marsh offer during the original summit, now returned in kind by a delegation that had finally learned the value of the question why. I will not pretend the negotiations were simple or quick. They stretched across 3 full days, filled with careful discussion over trade rates, border definitions, and the proper structure for resolving future disputes between humanity and coalition members. But the tone of every conversation was fundamentally different from anything I had witnessed before. Marsh and Holloway did not demand special treatment or attempt to leverage the fear their demonstrations had created across the galaxy. They asked, consistently and without exception, for the same terms offered to every other member of the coalition. Equal trade rates, equal representation on any tribunal handling disputes involving human interests, the same freedom to expand into unclaimed territory that every other species enjoyed, without requiring Assembly approval for decisions humanity was fully capable of making for itself. Vantor agreed to nearly every term, with a speed that surprised even me, and on the rare occasions where genuine disagreement arose, both sides approached the disagreement with a patience I had never once witnessed during my years watching Assembly diplomacy. There was no posturing, no attempt to gain advantage through delay or intimidation. When Talus raised a technical concern about resource allocation along a shared border region, Marsh's aides produced detailed proposals within hours, clearly having anticipated the concern long before it was raised, a level of preparation that spoke to exactly how carefully humanity had thought through every aspect of what a fair agreement should look like. On the evening of the second day, during a break in formal proceedings, I found myself standing alone near one of the wide observation windows, looking out at the green and blue world below, when Marsh approached and stood quietly beside me for a long moment before speaking. He asked whether I had been present at the original Threshold Summit, and I told him I had, seated in the gallery, watching from a distance. He nodded, unsurprised, and asked what I remembered most clearly from that day. I told him honestly that I remembered the silence after his delegation walked out, a silence that had unsettled me more than anything the assembly had said or done in that chamber, though I had not understood why at the time. Marsh was quiet for a moment, considering this, and then he told me something I have carried with me ever since. He said that humanity had never wanted to frighten anyone. They had walked away that day not out of pride, but because they understood, clearly and immediately, that agreeing to unbalanced terms in that first meeting would define every conversation that followed for generations. He said that humanity had learned, long before they ever reached the stars, that the terms you accept in your weakest moment become the terms others expect from you forever, and that the only way to avoid that trap was to walk away before agreeing to anything you were not willing to live with permanently. I asked him, carefully, whether the demonstrations that followed, the disabled Drathan fleet, the silent formation that turned back the Corvain convoy, had been planned from the very beginning, a calculated strategy to force the assembly back to the table on humanity's terms. He shook his head and told me that humanity had never planned any of it as strategy. They had simply protected what belonged to them, calmly and consistently, every single time someone tested that boundary, and had trusted that the rest of the galaxy would eventually understand what that consistency meant, without ever needing it explained through force beyond what safety required. I asked him one final question, the one that had followed me through every report I had read, every satellite image I had studied, every quiet, unsettled night I had spent trying to understand this species that had changed the shape of galactic diplomacy without ever raising its voice. I asked him why humanity had never once, in 18 months of demonstrated strength, used that strength to punish the assembly for the insult of the original Threshold Accord. He considered the question for a long moment, looking out at the world below, and then he told me that punishment was easy and cheap and never actually solved the problem that caused it in the first place. What humanity wanted, he said, was not to be feared. Fear, he told me, was simply what happened when other people did not yet understand you, and understanding, given enough time and enough patience, always cost less than the alternative. The negotiations concluded on the third day with a formal agreement, one built on equal footing, one that Vantor signed with a steadiness I had never seen him show during any previous summit. Marsh signed beside him, and Grace Holloway signed beside Marsh, and for the first time since I had begun this long, strange assignment following humanity's quiet transformation, I felt something in my chest ease, a weight I had not fully realized I was carrying until it finally lifted. We returned to assembly space 3 days later, and I remember standing once more in the gallery of the great domed chamber where the original Threshold Summit had collapsed into silence, watching Vantor present the new agreement to the full council, watching delegates who had once mocked humanity's proud, quiet walkout listen now with genuine respect to an account of what fairness had ultimately built between two very different peoples. I think often, even now, about that first day, about the stone that settled into my chest when Daniel Marsh stood up and walked away from a table built to diminish him. I understand it now, in a way I could not have understood it then. It was not fear of what humanity might do to us. It was the quiet, uncomfortable recognition that we had met a species patient enough to walk away rather than accept less than they deserved, disciplined enough to demonstrate their strength without ever needing to abuse it, and wise enough to understand that respect, freely given, built something far more lasting than fear ever could. The galaxy did learn to fear humanity in those 18 months of silence and quiet demonstration, and I do not think that fear ever fully disappeared, not even after the new agreement was signed, not even after trade resumed and borders were respected, and humanity took its rightful place among the oldest and most established members of the coalition. But I have come to believe that the fear itself was never really about humanity's power. Every species in the assembly held power of some kind. What frightened us, in the end, was something far rarer than power, and far harder to imitate. It was the sight of a species that never once needed to raise its voice to be heard, that never once needed to break a promise to make a point, and that walked away from an unfair table not because they were weak, but because they understood, more clearly than any of us, exactly what they were worth. I sit now in my quiet office within the Human Affairs Division, years after that long walk through the doors of the Waypoint Station, and I still think, from time to time, about the silence that followed Daniel Marsh out of that first chamber. I understand now that it was never really silence at all. It was patience, wearing silence as its only disguise, and it taught the entire galaxy a lesson none of us have ever forgotten. Some species raise their voices to be respected. Humanity simply stood, once, and walked away, and let the weight of that single quiet moment speak for them, louder and longer than any threat ever could.